The first time my daughter-in-law laughed at my accent, I didn't flinch, not even when her sharp giggle sliced through the quiet Sunday dinner like a knife, because I had spent a lifetime learning how to swallow pain without making a sound, how to let the world's cruelty roll off my shoulders like rain on a tin roof. But that night, as I watched her turn to my son with a smirk and say, "Mom, you really need to work on that accent. It's so old-fashioned," something inside me cracked, not with anger, but with the weight of memories I had buried for decades. Memories of a childhood spent in the dust-choked streets of a small Appalachian town where every word I spoke marked me as different, where my father's coal-stained hands and my mother's worn-out shoes whispered stories of sacrifice I didn't understand until I was old enough to feel the hunger in my own belly. Where I learned to read by candlelight because the electricity had been cut off for the third month in a row, where I promised myself I would never let my children suffer the way I did. And so I worked double shifts at the diner, scrubbed floors until my knees ached, and saved every dime to send my son to college, only to watch him fall in love with a woman who saw my accent as a joke, a relic of a past she thought she had escaped. But I didn't lash out, I didn't cry, I simply smiled and said, "You're right, dear, maybe I should." And then, as the children gathered around me after dinner, wide-eyed and eager for a bedtime story, I began to speak. Not about fairy tales or princesses, but about the war, about the day my brother left for Europe with a duffel bag and a promise to come back, about the telegram that arrived on a cold November morning, about the way my mother collapsed on the kitchen floor and how I held her while she sobbed, about the years that followed when I took in my brother's children after his wife died of grief, when I raised them as my own, teaching them to read, to write, to dream, even when the world told them they were nothing. And as I spoke, the children listened, their eyes wide with wonder, and I saw in their faces the same hunger I once felt, the same need to know that someone out there believed in them. And I knew then that my daughter-in-law's laughter had not broken me, but had instead awakened something deep inside, a fire that had been smoldering for years, a determination to teach these children not just words, but the strength to face a world that would try to silence them, to show them that every accent, every scar, every memory was a story worth telling, a lesson worth learning. And as the night deepened and the children drifted off to sleep, I sat in the dim glow of the lamp, my heart heavy with the weight of all I had lost, but also filled with the quiet pride of knowing that I had given them something no one could ever take away, the truth of who they were and who I had been. That night, after the laughter had faded and the guests had driven away, I sat alone in the makeshift guest room they'd given me, neat, sterile, a place meant for someone visiting, not belonging, and I stared at the cracked photo in my suitcase, my late husband in his army uniform from 1945, eyes fierce even in grayscale, the same eyes my son wears when he forgets himself. That photo had traveled through countries, through grief, through hunger, and I remember clutching it when the ship groaned. Across the Atlantic, the cold wind slicing through the thin cotton of my coat, my body trembling not just from the cold, but from the terror of a future spoken in a language that did not want me. Those early years in America were painted in soot and aspirin, working double shifts in a sewing factory while learning to pronounce please, and how much in a tongue that felt like chewing glass. Nights spent scrubbing blood out of my palms after broken needles, mornings spent listening to jazz on my neighbor's radio as I dreamed of a day when my words would sound like they belonged. But belonging never came easily, not for a widow carrying an accent and a scar, not for a woman who still dreamed in another alphabet, who flinched when fireworks cracked because they sounded too much like incoming fire. When I first met my daughter-in-law, she had the gloss of modern America. Perfect hair, perfect words, speaking fast and effortlessly, like someone who never had to earn a sentence, and she smiled politely when I mispronounced her fancy wine, patting my hand as if indulging a child. I thought kindness had lived in her touch back then. But I was wrong, because kindness without understanding turns sharp when tested. Still, I loved her for my son's sake, for the family dinners that felt like brief performances, and for my grandchildren who clung to my skirt when they were small and let me hum them lullabies in the old tongue, their laughter spilling like hope across my tired soul. As the years passed, the gap between us widened, built not from hatred but from the slow erosion of courtesy. Her sighs when I spoke too slowly, her glances when I added too much salt, her quiet corrections in front of guests, and each small wound gathered like dust on the sill of my restraint. That night, in the hush of the house, I felt the ache of old battles I thought I had buried under layers of forgiveness. But forgiveness can rot if left too long unspoken, and its decay smells a lot like regret. I rose, my hands instinctively searching for my rosary, though I hadn't prayed in years, whispering to the darkness, asking for strength, not strength to lash out, but to understand, to teach, to shape something out of this silent cruelty. Because deep inside I knew, revenge loses power if it burns others, but triumph lives in transformation, and so I decided that my vengeance would be disguised as love, that I would take her mockery, her brittle superiority, and turn it into a legacy her own. Children would one day cherish more than her polished words. I would teach them stories of war and loss, of the human cost behind each syllable, of how language holds memory, and of how pride in your roots is never a flaw. I would arm them not with perfect speech, but with compassion, and I would begin quietly, secretly, the next morning when the soft light poured into the kitchen and the world, or at least my little world, gave me another day to rewrite its cruelest tune. The next morning came draped in the muted hush of winter sunlight, thin and pale, filtering through lace curtains that had seen better days, and I woke before anyone else, my bones aching not just from age, but from the heaviness of what needed to be done. In the kitchen, while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, I began my quiet rebellion, mixing flour, sugar, and memory into the same bowl, kneading not just dough, but history itself, shaping it the way my mother once did when she told stories to keep our spirits warm through the war. As I rolled the dough, my granddaughter Emily shuffled in, her hair still tangled from sleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and she asked me why I always spoke differently. The question was innocent, yet it sliced deep, stirring the ache of every insult ever tucked behind someone's polite smile. I crouched beside her and told her the truth in the simplest way I could, that my words are like old keys opening doors to places she's never seen. She smiled at that. So I told her about the village I came from, the red-roofed cottages and fields of rye, the river that froze like glass in January, and the soldiers that came when I was only 6. I told her not of pain, but of courage, of how my mother once traded her wedding ring for milk, and how my father taught me that voices, no matter how broken, are the last things a tyrant can't steal. As she listened, her little hands resting on mine, I felt a bridge forming between two worlds that had always looked at each other from across generations of misunderstanding, By the time the others woke, Emily was proudly telling her brother how their granny spoke two languages because she was brave enough to start over. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law barely looked my way, her smile brittle around the edges. But when she heard her daughter repeating my story, her fork paused midair. She didn't say anything, but silence can be louder than words. In the following weeks, I made it my mission to fill my grandchildren's mornings with heritage disguised as play, teaching them songs that once echoed through the ruins of my village, letting them taste old recipes while I whispered the names of the women who taught me to make them, women who never lived long enough to see peace. I became their hidden school, their secret museum, each lesson planted like a seed that would one day outlive both me and my critics. Yet beneath that calm surface, the tension between my daughter-in-law and me thickened, twisting around every dinner conversation, every misunderstanding that she took as defiance, not knowing that my silence was not submission but calculation, because revenge, I learned long ago, is not fire, it's frost. It moves slowly, seeps quietly, and reshapes everything it touches. I was shaping her children not with bitterness, but with the kind of knowledge that makes cruelty look small. Still, some nights when the house was asleep, I'd weep into the dark, remembering the baby I lost during the war, the child who would have been Emily's age now, wondering if teaching someone else's children might be my way of finding her again. And even as I bathed in the warmth of my secret purpose, I sensed the gathering storm ahead. An event that would rip the truth out from under the polite lies of our family, forcing all of us to face what we had become and what love truly costs. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything began to twist, the kind of afternoon that seemed harmless at first. The air filled with the scent of roasted chicken, my grandchildren's laughter bouncing off the walls, and my daughter-in-law's perfect nails tapping her phone screen while my son read the newspaper, absent and unaware that the seams of our quiet house were about to tear. I had baked pastries that morning, small crescent rolls dusted with sugar, the ones my mother used to make at Christmas when warplanes thundered overhead and we sang louder to drown out fear. As I placed the tray on the table, Emily beamed and said proudly, "We made Babsh's rolls," and my daughter-in-law stiffened at the foreign word, her gaze flicking from me to her daughter like a spark looking for tinder. "Honey," she said, her voice sweet but sharp underneath. "We say Grandma here, remember?" And before I could bridge the gap with my usual quiet smile, Emily frowned and shook her head, insisting softly that Babsha was prettier. I saw something dark move across my daughter-in-law's expression, something she tried to hide behind a brittle laugh, and my heart sank because I'd seen that same look decades ago, in the faces of people who thought kindness had borders, who thought correctness could replace compassion. She turned to me then and said, as if playfully, "You're filling there. Heads with too much of the old stuff, they're Americans, Mom." The last word dragged out, heavy with irony. My son muttered quietly for her to stop, but it was too late. The air had already curdled, and she was looking right at me, waiting for me to flinch, waiting for that old tremor of guilt I used to carry. Instead, I looked her in the eye and said, gently but firmly, "Yes, they are Americans, but roots make the tree stand tall." The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through bone. And in that pause, something in her expression wavered, maybe doubt, maybe shame, but it passed as quickly as it came. The discussion ended abruptly with my son changing the subject, but under that polite surface, a fracture widened that none of us could mend. Later that evening, when I was tucking Emily into bed, she whispered, "Why doesn't Mommy like our secret stories?" And I had to pause before answering. Because the truth would wound her and she deserved softness, not scars. I told her that. Sometimes grown-ups forget where kindness begins when fear takes its place, and that fear often hides in laughter, in polished words, in perfect lives. She asked if I was angry, and I smiled and told her no, because anger was too small a word for something that had become my whole life's echo. After she fell asleep, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights blur against the snow, their glow reminding me of the candles we lit for the ones who never came home from the war. I thought of how every generation fights its own quiet battle. Mine was survival. My son's was belonging, and hers, perhaps, was remembering. I realized then that teaching her had become more than revenge. It was redemption, a final offering to the world I once escaped from, a world that still lived in my voice. And yet, as peace settled briefly over the sleeping house, I felt something else stirring on the horizon of our little family. An unseen reckoning that would soon demand every ounce of courage left in my aging heart, testing whether forgiveness could truly stand where fire once burned. The reckoning arrived on a gray morning thick with unspoken tension, when my son announced that they were moving to another state for his new job. A promotion he said was long overdue, and though his voice carried pride, I heard the tremor underneath. The one that told me he was caught between loyalties, between the woman he married and the woman who raised him. I smiled, said I was happy, but my stomach twisted into a knot of abandonment I had felt before, back when I was 18 and waving goodbye to everything I'd ever known from the deck of a ship leaving Poland. This time, it wasn't worth stealing my family. It was distance wrapped inside modern ambition. My daughter-in-law, glowing with satisfaction, hugged me politely, her perfume too strong, her words mechanical as she said they would visit often. Though we both knew often meant never in the language of convenience, Emily clung to me hard that day, tears streaking her cheeks, as I whispered that she could always call me that. I would write her letters the way my mother once wrote to me, folded prayers sealed in paper. But after they left, the house became heavier than silence, rooms echoing only my own footsteps, the ticking clock and the ghosts of all the yesterdays it had witnessed. I spent those first weeks trying to fill the emptiness, baking for no one, humming lullabies to the walls, even speaking aloud just to hear my voice. And in that loneliness, the old ache of my past returned, memories of trains that carried people away forever, of hunger, of losing my first child to illness while the doctor favored those who spoke cleaner English. I walked around with grief tucked into the corners of my apron, unseen but always there, until one day, months later, I received a small envelope postmarked with their new address. It was a drawing from Emily, me and her holding hands under a tree with the words, "My Babsha is my hero," scrawled across the top in uneven letters. I cried over that paper until it was soft as cloth and something fierce reignited in me. I would not fade into the background of their lives. I would remain through letters, through memories, through stories that turned absence into presence. So week by week, I wrote her letters dressed as fairy tales, where brave girls crossed rivers of fire and outwitted kings with sharp minds instead of beauty, sending her each envelope scented faintly with cinnamon and smoke. But one month, when no replies came, I realized the letters had stopped reaching her. My heart clenched, a familiar wound reopening. Someone was intercepting them, cutting the thread that tied me to her. My suspicion burned quietly but steadily, and when Christmas came without a call or a card, I understood. It was deliberate. My daughter-in-law had made sure my voice, my accent, my influence were erased. Yet she underestimated the endurance of a woman who had once survived bombs and famine. Because I didn't stop, I found another way, sending one letter through my son's old friend's address, another through the teacher's school office, small victories hidden in plain sight. For every attempt to silence me, I whispered louder through the cracks of their new life. And though she'd won the distance, she hadn't won Emily's heart, because in spring a new envelope arrived with just 3 words written in shaky child script. I remember Babsha. Those words became my anthem, my revenge, and my redemption. Proof that legacy does not vanish under mockery or miles. It simply waits for the right heart to keep it alive. The years rolled by quietly, much like the river behind my childhood home, seeming calm on the surface, but carrying unseen currents beneath, each season stealing a little more of my strength, each letter to Emily filling the hollow space her absence left behind. I aged alone in that creaking house, yet never truly alone, because the memories of those I had lost lived within its walls. The sharp laughter of my husband before he went off to war, the rustling lullabies of my mother, the distant echo of the coastal cities where I first learned how to live with less. I spoke to ghosts daily, as if they were watching over me from the corners where the light refused to settle. Then one late autumn evening, as the wind pressed against the windows like a begging child, my phone rang. It was Emily, her voice trembling with excitement. Older now, a young woman grown out of the tiny hands that once clung to my skirt. She said she had found my letters after all, hidden in an old box in the attic, postmarked and unopened, each one telling pieces of her mother's history she had never been allowed to hear. And in her trembling voice I felt the years fold in on themselves, the pain of absence turning suddenly into connection. She whispered, "Babsha, you survived everything, didn't you?" And I told her softly that survival is not the absence of pain, but the art of carrying it with grace. She promised to come see me soon. But life, as it always does, had other plans. Months passed and I could feel my time thinning, my breath shortening, like the slow fade of a candle that has burned too long. In those quiet days, I sat on the porch, wrapped in my old shawl, watching the seasons shift, and though I never said it aloud, I forgave my daughter-in-law somewhere deep in the quiet of my heart, not because she deserved it, but because hate was too heavy to take into the next life. I understood her now in a strange way. How fear dresses itself as arrogance. How shame hides behind correction. How sometimes people mock what they cannot carry. Still, one piece of me longed for her to understand what she had destroyed, because when a woman silences another's story, she buries part of her own. Then one morning, a car pulled up, and I knew before the door opened who it was. Emily stepped out wrapped in a long coat, eyes red from crying, holding something against her chest. It was my letters, bound in ribbon, edges frayed, paper worn. The years carved into their creases. She ran into my arms and whispered that her mother never told her why she hated the sound of my voice, only that it made her feel small, and I held her tighter, realizing that in mocking me, my daughter-in-law had been running from the reflection of her own inadequacy, terrified of a strength she didn't understand. That night, Emily read my letters aloud to me, one after another, her voice steady and full of reverence, each word stitching together the fabric of our shared past. I listened, half in dream, half in memory, as the voices of my dead rose again with each story, until the room felt filled with all the generations that had suffered, endured, and learned to love beyond bitterness. By the time dawn came, I knew what I had done would outlive me, that I had not only taught her, but through her had taught the world that kindness, wisdom, and even pain, when passed down honestly, can heal what mockery once tried to destroy. The morning after Emily's visit felt like one of those stolen gifts from God, the kind that comes at the edge of endings, when time loses its sharpness and everything slows into something tender. I awoke to her humming softly in the kitchen, The same song I used to hum when she was a child and sleep wouldn't come. The song my mother sang over the sound of distant sirens. I sat up, my body frail, but my heart alive in a way it hadn't been in years, and I watched her move through my home, touching things gently, as if afraid her love might break them. When she brought me tea, her hands shook, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she wanted to say. We sat in silence for a long while until she finally asked, "Babsha, do you ever regret staying silent all those years when people mocked you?" And I looked at her, the lines around my eyes deep as old roads, and told her that silence can be both a shield and a cage. It protects the heart, but imprisons the soul if held too long. I confessed that for decades I mistook endurance for peace, not realizing that even quiet women can roar through love. She nodded, understanding more than words could teach, and I thought how young women today carried battles on their tongues that would have gotten mine burned. In her presence, I felt my story finally complete, a circle drawn in trembling hands, closing softly. Later that afternoon, she suggested we visit my daughter-in-law and her father to mend what could still be mended. Part of me resisted, the ache of old humiliation still sharp as a blade. But Emily's eyes held that same stubborn hope that used to live in my own. So I agreed, and a week later, we drove through the winding country roads toward their home. The journey felt like traveling through my own memories, the crisp smell of rain, the front yards dotted with pumpkins, and the faint hum of the radio carrying hymns I hadn't heard in decades. When we arrived, my son looked older, slower, his hair silvered and eyes wet with guilt. My daughter-in-law stood beside him, polite but nervous, her composure flickering every time our eyes met. I greeted them with kindness I didn't fully feel, but sometimes kindness is just courage wearing a softer name. She invited me in, her voice lower than I remembered, and as we sat together, silence swelled between us, filled not with spite this time, but with the exhaustion of years wasted on pride. Emily broke it by reading one of my letters aloud, a simple one about making soup from scraps during the war and how love, like broth, deepens when shared. My daughter-in-law's eyes filled before she could hide it, and when Emily finished, I could see the realization washing over her that my accent, once mocked, carried not ugliness but history, the residue of survival. She reached for my hand hesitantly, whispering, "I didn't understand then, and though it was late, though the years had made forgiveness heavier than stone, I squeezed her fingers and said, 'Now you do.' And that is enough." For the first time in decades, the house was quiet without hostility, filled only with the murmur of reconciliation. That night, as I lay in Emily's room, listening to the wind slip through the curtains, I felt the weight of vengeance lift from me. It was no longer revenge I had achieved, but redemption, not ruin, but repair. And when I drifted to sleep, I saw my mother's face in the fog of dreams. Smiling the same worn smile she gave the day we boarded that ship, whispering that the only victory worth winning is love returned from understanding. The days that followed our visit unfolded like the fragile pages of a long-lost book finally reopened, their air thick with tentative peace, the kind that doesn't come easily after years of silence and resentment. Each morning I found myself sitting in their kitchen, this time not as an intruder, but as a quiet part of the rhythm. Emily bringing me tea, my son asking softly if I slept well, and even my daughter-in-law hovering nearby, unsure but trying, her movements slower now, less defensive. One afternoon, When sunlight spilled across the table in golden stripes, she sat across from me holding one of my old recipe cards, the paper yellowed and corners worn, and she asked if I would teach her to make the soup her children adored. It seemed such a small thing, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. As we chopped vegetables side by side, she told me about her own childhood. The house that looked perfect but felt cold. The mother who measured affection in achievements the way she had. Always feared sounding ignorant among polished people. I listened quietly, realizing that her mockery years ago hadn't been born out of cruelty alone, but out of shame disguised as judgment. And for the first time I saw the girl she must have been, lonely and uncertain, looking for armor in the wrong places. Together we prepared the old soup, the kind born of poverty and memory, thick with potatoes, garlic, and humility. The taste of survival still lingering behind every spoonful when it was done. She tasted it and began to cry softly, not out of sorrow, but exhaustion from carrying guilt too long. I placed a hand on hers and said, "You tried to bury what you didn't understand, but our roots grow even through stone." Later that evening, after dinner, Emily played a recording on her phone, a school project she had made about languages and heritage, where she spoke in both English and Polish, her voice trembling but strong. She said, "My grandmother taught me that every accent is a story trying to survive." And I watched my daughter-in-law's face crumble in quiet realization that her children's pride had become the very legacy she once rejected. None of us spoke for a long while. Even my son, who usually filled silences with talk, simply reached for my hand and held it as though anchoring himself to something he'd nearly lost. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, autumn leaves swirling like old ghosts set free, and I thought of how every generation must rewrite their pain into meaning, how war becomes wisdom, humiliation becomes empathy, and distance becomes a bridge when hearts finally learn to listen. That night, as they prepared the guest room for me once more, I felt no bitterness, no fire of revenge, only an overwhelming sense of completion. Before I drifted to sleep, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for what had been taken from me, but for what I had managed to return to the world. The reminder that every wound, spoken or hidden, has the power to teach. Love, if only someone dares to listen to its accent without fear. The morning light drifted through the curtains like a memory refusing to fade, soft and golden, touching everything in that quiet house with a tenderness I had not felt in decades. I woke before the others, as I always did, a habit formed back when survival started before sunrise, and I sat by the window watching the world stir awake, leaves trembling in the soft wind, birds tracing invisible paths in the sky. My body was weak, slower now, whispering its own kind of farewell, but my heart felt astonishingly light, as if all that grief I had stored for half a century was finally exhaled. Downstairs, I heard my daughter-in-law's gentle voice urging Emily to hurry for school, and then laughter, warm, untouched by mockery, rippling through the hall like redemption made sound. I leaned back in the chair, eyes closed, listening to the sound of a home that had finally learned to breathe. When Emily came upstairs to hug me goodbye, she slipped something into my lap. It was a small notebook, bound in blue leather, filled with her handwriting. Pages upon pages of memories we had shared, stories I told her, recipes I taught, even fragments of the songs I sang. At the end she wrote, "This is your voice, Babsha. It will never be lost again." I wanted to thank her, to tell her that legacy is not blood or name, but the courage to keep love alive. But the words caught in my throat, my chest heavy with both pride and the ache of all that was ending. After they left for the day, the house felt peaceful, and I sat for hours flipping through the notebook, my wrinkled fingers tracing her letters as if touching time itself. In that stillness, I found myself drifting, not into grief, not into regret, but into remembrance. I thought of that farm in Poland, my mother's hands kneading bread, my father's laughter echoing from the fields before the war swallowed him. And I realized that every life, no matter how small it seems, carries forward like a whisper in another story. Late that afternoon, my daughter-in-law returned, alone. She sat across from me, eyes red from tears, holding the same photograph of my husband I had once kept by my bedside. Her voice broke as she thanked me, not just for teaching her children, but for showing her that kindness is not weakness, and that identity is not something to erase, but something to embrace. I told her that forgiveness is the longest road, but the only one that leads home. We cried together, two women who had spent half a lifetime circling the same pain from opposite sides. When she left the room to prepare tea, I stayed by the window, watching the sunlight melt across the floor, and I felt my mother's voice again, faint but certain, whispering that I had done what I came here to do. As dusk approached, I wrote one last letter to Emily, sealing it beside the blue notebook, a message she would find when I was gone. That love, when carried with pride, can outlive cruelty, and that teaching is the purest form of survival. That night, as stars shimmered over the sleeping town, I finally rested, not with sorrow, but with the quiet, triumphant peace of a woman who had turned her pain into legacy.